Hey, what's up? It's me. Call me Ishmael. I don't know. We're here for a new book series. Are you ready? I'm pumped. Malcolm X. Excellent book, brilliant thinker. I think there's a lot to take away from this. Hopefully, y'all can hear. This is my view. I'm up on a roof. Planes are flying by and stuff, but hopefully the mic cancels that out. If not, you're going to hear a lot of planes. Back to X. I think we're to do part one. I don't know how many parts there'll be. We'll figure it out. But we're going to talk about why he matters first, and then the first part of the book, which is his childhood and his school experience. I think he's underappreciated in the pantheon of civil rights leaders. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Generally speaking, he's underappreciated. Second, I think the version that we get of him is simplified. It's like, I think the same thing with Martin Luther King, frankly, but you're handed this like Hallmark card version of them, and it's a caricature that like Malcolm X was dangerous. He's way overlooked and just simplified in that regard. I also think he's misclassified. A lot of people identify his early thinking of like whites are evil. There's no like there has to be complete separation, and just stick with that. And they look at his like message of self-defense, and they're scared by it. So I think he's misclassified. But ultimately, this book matters because the message of empowerment is beautiful, and his voice, man, his writing voice is sharp, real sharp. So we're going to get into it. Quickly going through a couple of events. I really encourage you to read this. It's beautiful. It's really well written. But we'll cover a few events here. And Frederick Douglass, in his book Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, American Slave, says at one point he says, "You have seen how a man was transformed into a brute. Now you will see how a slave was made a man." And I think that Malcolm X, that the central question is, what does it mean to be a man? How is a man made in modern America? This being, the kind of the 1960s is when he's writing this book. So how does one become a man? How does one assert yourself in modern life? Well, his childhood was difficult, to say the least. He was born in 1925. He was born as Malcolm Little. He changes his name to X, his last name to X later in his life. We'll get to that. Pretty cool reason why he does it, I think. And the first chapter is titled Nightmare. I'm going to just read the first paragraph, the opening paragraph of chapter 1, just to get the idea of like, whoa. My mother was pregnant with me, she later told me. When my mother was pregnant with me, she later told me, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Okay, here comes the Klan. Surrounding the house, brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. Imagine that. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, so maybe she turned, visibly pregnant. She told them she was alone with 3 small children. And my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. So, okay, his father's a preacher. Klansmen shouted threats, warnings heard. We better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father's spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the back to Africa preaching of Marcus Garvey. Woo! What? So that's when his mother is pregnant with her. It kind of reminds me of Tupac Shakur's mother being pregnant with him as she faced trial. That's whole other story, but there's little Malcolm in her stomach or uterus. Talking to too many kids, man. And I think that you get sense right away. I mean, the title of this chapter is Nightmare. So his childhood is not fun and games or just like, hey, everyone's hanging out, having a good time. It's difficult. And you really get that sense early on that it's a very difficult childhood. He foreshadows his own death, by the way. Malcolm X was murdered. And he says, this is on page 4, at least in mine, "It has always been my belief that I, too, will die by violence. I have done all that I can to be prepared." Martin Luther King also kind of foreshadowed his own death. And here you see Malcolm X doing it as well. So I think when you grow up in conditions of violence and when you stand for the truth and you speak openly, as X did during this time, it was almost an inevitable outcome. And for a lot of people, it does still seem to be an inevitable outcome. If you saw my previous post, you kind of know what I'm talking about. But it's sad that he can kind of even predict how he's going to end. Coffee. All right. There's another instance where I think is fascinating too, and this is right off the bat too, and page 6. The family has to like move around a little bit. His father is kind of going around preaching, talking about a message of Black empowerment that gets him in trouble with the Klan. And another time that they're attacked at their house, and the Klan burns their house to the ground. And what happened was Malcolm X's dad comes out with a pistol and scares some people off. And the police show up the next day and they're like, hey, where'd you get that gun? Just think about that for a second. That implies the people who went to burn down his house and got scared off by the gun, the handgun, are cozy with the police. Maybe they are the police. They go in there, hey, when we were trying to burn guy's house down, he came out with a gun. And it's not like, oh, you were trying to burn somebody's house down, you're getting in trouble. No, it's let's go get that Black person. So the system against keeping Blacks in a subservient position at this time, and some would argue still, is tremendous. And X is fighting against that system. So he says, was called in for, I remember that my father was called in from question about a permit for the pistol, which he had shot at the white man who set the fire. I remember the police were always dropping by our house, shoving things around, just checking or looking for a gun. The pistol they were looking for, which they never found, for which they wouldn't issue a permit, was sewed up inside a pillow. My father's .22 rifle and a shotgun, though, were right out in the open. Everyone had them for hunting birds and rabbits and other games. So you were allowed to have the shotgun and the .22 little rifle. But a Black guy was not permitted to have a handgun. So he had it sewed up in his pillow. And I think that's very telling in terms of like the self-defense that X would promote later in his life. And again, kind of growing up in a violent situation. Speaking of violence, his father is killed, and it sounds like it's murder. It sounds like he was like murdered and kind of thrown on the train tracks, but it's not entirely clear. And apparently he struggled with this. He wasn't sure his entire life, but the insurance company sure was. They said, we're not paying this claim. And that kind of set he had 2 insurance policies. One, the smaller one paid, the bigger one said, we're not doing it. So that kind of set his mother, she's got 6 kids, on a path where it's very difficult for her to get by. He's growing up in the Great Depression. So he's born 1925, and the Great Depression officially starts in 1929. And that you got 6 kids, a single mother, a murdered father, in the midst of the Great Depression. And so he's feeling a lot of pain. There was, on page 17, there was times there wasn't even a nickel, and we'd be so hungry we were dizzy. My mother would boil a big pot of dandelion greens. We would eat that. I remember that some small-minded neighbor put it out. The children would tease us that we ate fried grass. It's tough, man. It's tough. So he grew up in a really tough situation, and was like hunting for food and stuff. His mother suffers a mental decline, mental health decline. And something similar happened to Woody Guthrie, who's another person I like to study. Basically, if you were a female in the 1920s or the 1930s who had mental health problems, they weren't very kind about it. We're much more understanding now that therapy exists. Back then it was like, oh, you're crazy. We're gonna take you away and put you in a home. We're gonna just seal you off. You're gonna be in solitary confinement, essentially. And that's what happens to his mother. And I can't describe how I felt. The woman who brought me into the world and nursed me and advised me, this is 26, and chastened me and loved me and didn't know me. It was as if I was trying to walk up the side of the hill on feathers. I looked at her. I listened to her talk, but there was nothing I could do. And then he says, I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. So the state agency, arguably, again, another system of control, frankly, that the whites put on the blacks, he says it destroyed our family by taking away the mother. And again, mental health was not very advanced in those days. And I think especially if you were a woman, the system was a bit harsher against you. So, wow, quite the start, right? I don't exactly blame him for having some residual anger here. What happens next is he's sent to reform school. He starts acting up in school, so he gets sent to, they told me I was going to reform school. I was still 13 years old. But first I was going to a detention home. It's on page 30. And he bounces around from foster homes and he goes into these reform schools. And one thing that stands out, and this second chapter is called Mascot, is he is smart. He's a little bit smarter than, well, as you read the book, you're figuring out he's smarter than almost anyone you'll meet. This is a brilliant, brilliant mind. And I like listening to X's speeches too, in his interviews. Goodness gracious, he spoke at like 1,000 miles an hour. There was no slowing this guy down. It's awesome. So, page 34. He uses Negro, which was the term for Black or African American at the time. I have no problem using Negro. When he uses the N-word, it's always used in insulting terms against him. I'm not going to say that. I don't, in case your screen's off, I am not a Black guy. I'm a Latino, white guy, whatever. So I'm not going to say it, even though it's present in the book. Some of the white kids I found were even friendlier than some of those in Lansing had been. Though some, including the teachers, called me N-word. It was easy to see they didn't mean any more harm by it than the Swirlins, who was like the family he lived with, and they would call him the N-word. As the N-word of my class, I was in fact extremely popular. I suppose partly because I was a kind of novelty. I was in demand, I had top priority. That's important. This whole, oh, you're different, this novelty aspect. X identifies that early as something that he can use to his advantage and exploit. It's like a little, it's something that he's going to come back to, especially later. You'll see when we get into the next lesson here. He starts to kind of play this role that white people are expecting to get certain things out of them. So he starts to see that he's the N-word of the class. He's a mascot. And then he has a pretty shitty conversation, pardon my French, but so I'm a teacher, and it just saddens me that someone would say this to a kid. So he's talking to his teacher one day, and he's doing very well in school. I think he's like class president or something like that. And he says, he's sticking around talking to, I was one of his top students, one of the school's top students. But you could see from me the kind of future in your place that almost all white people see for Black people. X talks about how successful at the time meant, oh, you're going to be a shoe cleaner or like take a lower kind of job that the whites are like, we're fine with you having that. So anyway, he told me, this is the teacher, Malcolm, you ought to be thinking about your career. Have you been giving it any thought? The truth is I hadn't. I'd never figured out 43 why. I told him, why, yes, sir. I've been thinking I'd like to be a lawyer. Lansing, Michigan, certainly had no Negro lawyers or doctors either in those days to hold up an image I might have aspired to. All I knew for certain was a lawyer didn't wash dishes as I was doing. Mr., how do you say this, Ostrowski looked surprised. I remember, and leaned back in his chair and clapped his hands behind his head. He's pensive almost. He says, he kind of half smiled and said, Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me now. We all like you here, you know that. But you gotta be realistic about being an N-word. A lawyer, that's no realistic goal for an N-word. You need to think about something you can be. Everyone admires your carpentry shop work. Oh, you're good at making things. Why don't you plan on carpentry? People like you as a person. You'll get all kinds of work. But again, a lawyer, that's no realistic goal for an N-word. You're like, what? Again, I just finished teaching Douglas. So it's kind of like fresh in my mind. Douglas has a moment where he wakes up when he's told he's learning how to read a little bit. He's like 8. And his master says to his wife, who's teaching Malcolm how to read, you can't teach a slave how to read. It's going to make him miserable. It's going to spoil him. And Malcolm was like, Douglas, that was his light bulb moment. That's his like, okay, now I know I got to learn how to read. So this is also kind of like a light bulb moment when someone says, or like a pivot, right? X is like kind of on this little future, going on his path, talking to a white person who says, you can't do that. And X is going to be like, oh yeah, watch me. Watch what I can do. Watch how I step up and beyond the expectations, the artificial expectations that you've set for me. So I'm pumped, man. Next up, we'll look at some forbidden fruits. It's going to get interesting. Questions, comments, holler in the chat, email, whatever. It's all good. Andale pues. Welcome to Malcolm X.